Welcome back, gang. This is part 2 of our Chapter 17 lecture series. This section is called The Segregated South. The focus question for this section is, how did the liberties of blacks after 1877 give way to legal segregation across the South? As we discussed in the lecture series for the previous chapter, after 1877, a group known as the Redeemers came into power in the southern United States, and this was a coalition of democratic merchants, planters, and business entrepreneurs who came to dominate the politics of the next couple of decades, really. And the fundamental point of their plan was to undo as much of Reconstruction, particularly radical Reconstruction, as they possibly could, while still retaining the basic formula set by the 13th through the 15th Amendments, those constitutional amendments that the state governments really could not get around. They began by authorizing new laws that called for the arrest of unemployed persons and increased penalties for petty crimes like minor theft and jaywalking, things of that nature, while also authorizing the renting out of convict labor in a situation not too far removed from slavery. Of course, these policies disproportionately affected the black population in the South, although it also did affect the poor white population as well. Overall, the dream of a new South that was the kind of calling card for Southerners in the period after the Civil War, who dreamed of, along with Northern assistance, expanding the industrial economy and diversifying agriculture to try to raise the economic standard of the South more on par with that of the North. This dream, while it did see some success in some industrialization and agricultural diversification, in no way did the South rise to the economic success level of its northern counterpart. In reality, the region generally sank deeper into poverty and remained almost completely dependent on the North for capital, for business ventures, and for manufactured goods. Black farmers generally suffered the most from the economic and social policies imposed by Southern governments after 1877, particularly those sharecroppers and tenant farmers, which comprised the majority of the black farming population. In Southern cities, however, networks of institutions like schools and churches served as the foundation for a growth of a small but growing black middle class. The labor market in general, both rural and urban, divided along racial lines in this period. And the policies of these redemption governments led to the desire of many black Americans to try to escape the South, once again, like they did during that antebellum period, to seek their economic and social opportunity elsewhere. And this led to what was known as the Kansas Exodus. There was a mass immigration of tens of thousands of blacks from the South into the Kansas Territory in this period. Most lacked the capital to buy land, however, and ended up as unskilled laborers in towns and cities. And really, their economic situation did not really improve all that much. Few, however, chose to return to the South under the thumb of these new redemption governments. Overall, however, most African Americans had little choice but to remain in the region due to their poverty and their inability to seek opportunity elsewhere. After 1877, these Southern redemption governments tried various efforts to limit African American civil rights and rescind many Reconstruction era policies. But despite this, black voting and office holding continued after 1877, despite this consolidation of Democratic control. One thing the Democrats had not figured out quite yet was how to limit black access to the vote and black access to office holding. Despite this continued access for African Americans to the political sphere, men and women of talent, many of them focused their energies in other areas, including excellence in chosen careers or the establishment of organizations like the National Association of Colored Women. African American access to the vote and to office holding began to change in the 1890s, and this was really a response to the Southern fusion movement in that period. And the fusion movement in the South was this coalition between blacks, particularly African American farmers, and white populists who sought to combine their voting power in order to push through some of the populist parties' measures in this period. Now, this sort of biracial political cooperation raised the specter once again of Negro rule and alleged corruption, which was the heart of the argument against black enfranchisement and office holding during that Reconstruction period when blacks first were gained the access to the vote and to office holding. And because of this perceived threat of this biracial political cooperation that would usher in a new era of black office holding at even greater levels than it already existed, the Southern Redemption governments began to enact new measures to seek to eliminate black voting from the electorate. And such measures included things like the poll tax, literacy test, and they also combined this with a grandfather clause, which basically stated that anyone whose grandfather was able to vote prior to the Civil War could continue to exercise their right to vote without having to pay poll taxes or to pass any sort of literacy test. Of course, because African Americans, none of them had the right to vote prior to the Civil War, that grandfather clause excluded all African Americans from that, who then, of course, were forced to pay the poll tax and take those literacy tests in order to maintain their access to the vote, and many of them, of course, could not do either one of those. Southerners argued that such efforts would help provide stability to politics and prevent violence between the races over political issues. An example of such violence was the Wilmington race riot in 1898. That was really a coup d'etat when whites in Wilmington, North Carolina, violently overthrew the local Wilmington government, which did have quite a few African American office holders. And the violence associated with the Wilmington race riot and other incidents similar to that called into question whether this biracial political cooperation was even feasible at all. And the answer to that from many Southerners was that, no, this is not feasible. The only way to quell the violence and to bring stability back into politics was to try to eliminate certain elements from the electorate. And that included, of course, many African Americans, but also many poor white voters as well, as this whole issue of disenfranchisement was not just a race issue, although it certainly was a race issue, it was also a class issue. Many political elites were just as afraid of the lower class whites as they were of blacks. And it was particularly the lower class whites who had the more virulent threads of racism in their general attitudes, where the elite Southerners still kind of adhere to kind of that old paternalist mindset from the antebellum period, where they viewed themselves as caretakers of a African American American populace that was still evolving into its role in American life and American politics, and had not quite reached the level of advancement yet to be able to fully participate in American political discourse. The efforts of Southern governments to segregate their populations, which began in that redemption period after 1877 and reached full steam in the 1890s, was validated by several Supreme Court decisions in this period. In 1883, the Supreme Court invalidated the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which required equal access and equal treatment of all races in public areas. The 1883 Supreme Court decision basically stated that this policy of equal access and equal treatment only applied to state authorities, not private businesses, which opened the door for private businesses to begin excluding certain members of the population, namely African Americans, from access to their businesses and resources. There was also the Plessy versus Ferguson case, which occurred in 1896. And this basically approved state laws that required separate facilities for blacks and whites. The lawsuit said that this was, of course, completely unfair. The Supreme Court said that as long as the facilities were equal, the idea of separate but equal, then this separation was fundamentally legal and just. However, as you can see here, there's a couple pictures here. This one is an African-American school, a typical one from the period. And this, of course, you see here, it was a white school, a typical one of the period. And just by looking at the exteriors of these, you can see the gross discrepancies between these facilities. They certainly were not equal at all. However, that didn't change the fact that through this Plessy versus Ferguson decision, it basically legalized the ability of state governments to require separate facilities for African Americans and white Americans. Plessy versus Ferguson decision, combined with the efforts of Southern state governments to disenfranchise African American voters, led to the advent of the Jim Crow era, official legal segregation in the South. And especially after Plessy versus Ferguson, Southern governments passed laws mandating segregation in just about every aspect of life. And this was really part of an all-encompassing system of white domination that even included an elaborate social etiquette that required African Americans to show deference to the white citizens that in public spaces in particular. Now, the Southern excuse for these laws at this period were various. Many Southerners saw it as actually assisting both white and African American society, that these two societies were not ready yet for cooperation, for integration, that they both still needed to develop further on their own accord before such integration and cooperation would even be feasible or workable. These laws, of course, as I mentioned before, would help promote social stability, as if the races were prevented from intermingling in public spaces, it would prevent racial violence and racial upheaval, particularly like the Wilmington race riot that we discussed in the previous slides. They saw this as an attempt to end political corruption and manipulation, particularly of what they saw as the ignorant African American voter. And as I mentioned, this segregation was thought to allow each society to develop according to its own means and its own values. Now, these laws did not just affect African Americans, however. It also affected other groups, including Chinese Americans, Mexican Americans, and American Indians as well. Now, believe it or not, in this period, many African Americans, including many prominent African American leaders in this period, actually supported many of these segregation measures. They too saw the violence of the 1890s surrounding black political participation and black office holding as detrimental to their communities. And they saw the fact that white racism was not going away anytime soon, and they viewed that white culture and white society was not quite ready yet for integration, and that if continued black efforts to push for full integration would only exacerbate the violence and lead to destruction on both sides. And many of these prominent black leaders took to emphasizing economic self-help and individual advancement for African Americans within an insular African American community and society. One of these prominent black leaders was Booker T. Washington, and he was the founder of the famous Tuskegee Institute, one of the first African American colleges in the South. And in this period, he pushed forward what was known as the Atlanta Compromise. And in the speech that established this compromise, he urged blacks to adjust to segregation and abandon their agitation for rights, again under this idea that it would bring back some stability to both African American and white societies. And he incorporated his view into his vocational college at Tuskegee. And this arose from the sense that frontal assaults on white power were impossible and dangerous. Although segregation did help to quell some of the more massive racial violence, like that of the Wilmington Race Riot in 1898, it certainly did not end violence against African Americans in the South. And this period saw the rise of lynching. And those African Americans who either refused or by some accident of fate failed to comply with segregation policies often face violent reprisal through lynching, which was nothing more than extrajudicial mob justice, where a group of average, everyday white citizens in a certain locale would take it upon themselves to be judge, jury, and executioner of African Americans accused of crimes. And most of the victims of this sort of extrajudicial mob justice were African American men accused of raping white women, which in just about every case was a lie. But this was justified as preserving the sanctity of white womanhood. And there began to be a myth spread that there was a crisis of these over-sexualized, bestial African-American men lurking around every corner looking to rape white women, which of course greatly increased the ire against many African Americans and white communities who believed this myth and believed this lie. However, African Americans didn't necessarily take the rise of lynching lying down, and even African American women began to get into the act of pushing back against lynching and violence against African Americans, particularly African American males. And one of the most prominent in this area in this era was a lady named Ida B. Wells, who became one of the nation's leading anti-lynching crusaders, who traveled the country advocating for the passage of new lynch laws that would make this sort of extrajudicial mob justice not only illegal, which technically it already was, but impose strict new penalties on such cases. As was mentioned previously in the lecture, the rise of populism in the People's Party coincided with new efforts towards reconciliation between the white North and the white South to finally bury the hatchet, to heal those old scars of the Civil War once and for all. Much of this reconciliation, however, occurred at the expense of people of color, as Northerners put more emphasis and more focus on these reconciliation efforts and essentially ignored the spread of segregation and the rights of African Americans in the South. This also led to the rise of a new ideology that became known as the Lost Cause, which romanticized slavery as some sort of moral good that benefited African Americans, and romanticized the Old South and antebellum Southern society and Southern culture, and of course romanticized the Confederate experience itself. And the impetus behind this was really the sons and daughters of Confederate veterans who sought to defend the honor of their parents, which is a natural inclination for most human beings who want to view their parents as honorable people who fought for an honorable cause. And this is the period when you start to see the spread and the establishment of Confederate monuments throughout the South, as the sons and daughters of Confederate veterans sought to memorialize their parents and their ancestors. Southern churches played a key role as well in keeping the lost cause and the myth of the Old South alive. And many of them, in fact all of them, refused to reunite with Northern branches, which is why today you still have different branches of, like, the Baptist Protestant denomination between Southern Baptists and regular Baptists. So that concludes part 2 of our Chapter 17 lecture series. As always, study hard, and I'll see you soon.